there, welcome to part 2 of What is Life? We'll just cover the last 3 characteristics of life. The first 2 being all living things are made of cells, and all living things acquire and use energy. We saw that in video number 1. So today we want to talk about 3 other characteristics. All living things process hereditary information. When we say hereditary, we mean something that we get from our parents, and in this case we're talking about DNA. All living things are capable of reproduction. Not much to say there. We know all living things reproduce, and all living things evolve. So let's try and tie these things together. As always, let's clear up a few terms. DNA is probably a word that you've heard before. Chromosome is probably a word that you've heard before. And gene is probably a word that you've heard before. And maybe you use these 3 somewhat interchangeably. Say I get my genes from my parents, I get chromosomes from my parents, or my DNA from my parents. And all this is true, but there is a slight distinction between the 3. So DNA is the type of substance that we use to code our genetic information. So when we talk about your DNA is a molecule that codes for how you look, how your body carries out certain chemical reactions like digesting certain molecules in your food, and it determines a lot of things about you and how you function and how you appear. So it's a substance, it's a molecule. A chromosome is also a molecule. It's a structure, however, that consists of DNA as well as the proteins that kind of wrap this DNA and make it a compact structure. Now, DNA is like a long, stringy kind of a molecule, and when your cell is managing the DNA, perhaps moving it around in preparation of cell division, the DNA is not in a long, stringy, unfolded state. It's actually a compact structure called a chromosome, wrapped around protein. So you can almost think about if you had wool, a whole lot of wool. Well, if you're knitting, you don't just have a big pile of stringy wool. You have the wool rolled around itself, maybe rolled around some kind of a spool, right, to keep it organized. So a chromosome is DNA with its associated proteins. And human beings have 46 of these molecules, 46 chromosomes. It's actually 23 pairs, and every pair has the same genes. This is something we'll look at more when we talk about genetics. A gene is one genetic instruction. So when I tell you that DNA codes for everything that your body does, well, your body does a lot of different things, right? And ultimately, anything that your body does is carried out by a protein. Okay, all the work done by your body is carried out by a protein. And every protein in your body is coded for by one gene. So every gene codes for one protein. So if you look at the genetic code, if you look at DNA as a molecule, it's a molecule that looks like this. And you see here, so this is one strand of DNA, or there's a representation of one strand of DNA. And you can see here there's these repeating subunits. Okay, we call each of these repeating subunits a nucleotide. Okay, so DNA is a polymer, meaning it's made of repeating structures. All right, so here we have a chain of nucleotides. And the nucleotides, if you look carefully, you can see here on the right, okay, this part of the nucleotide varies. There are 4 different kinds of nucleotides. And as we'll see later, every nucleotide can be represented by one of 4 letters, A, T, G, or C. So DNA is kind of like its own alphabet. And when we say that DNA codes for a protein, it's basically making these genetic words and genetic sentences that tell the body how to work. More on that in a few seconds. Let's try and get a sense of what a chromosome is. So here we have a string of DNA, your genetic code. All right, and what they've represented here, this little red dash here, well, they're saying that's one gene. So on this stretch of DNA, we have a gene that codes for a particular protein. I'll try an analogy, see if it works. Think about if you have a recipe book, and in your recipe book you have recipe for many different meals. Let's say it's a baking book. I'm in a sweet mood today. Let's say you have for a recipe for chocolate cake, you have a recipe for apple pie. Well, in your DNA, if you consider DNA kind of the ink upon which you write your recipes, it's what you actually use to write it out, well, you would have genes for different functions. So a gene is kind of the equivalent to a recipe. And you'll have one gene, let's say, for the protein that is going to digest sugar. Okay? You'll have a gene for the protein that gives your eyes a particular color. You'll have a gene that gives you a particular hair color, and so on and so forth, for all of the things that your body ends up doing. Now, this is not it's kind of an oversimplification. Sometimes one trait, like eye color or skin color, actually requires several genes. But for this example, let's just say every gene codes for one protein, and therefore every gene codes for one job, one recipe. So here's our molecule of DNA. If you go down here, can skip down to this step. This is a condensed chromosome. So when you want to kind of compact this long string of DNA, you wrap it around proteins called histones, and you'll get a little compact structure. You see here in the electron micrograph, this is one chromosome. It's the same stringy DNA, it's just all wrapped up, so it's easier to manage. All right, so DNA is the repeating nucleotides that make up this long string. Right? A chromosome is a molecule of DNA with its associated proteins to make it compact, and a gene is one genetic instruction. One genetic instruction. And again, remember that DNA has, it's basically consists of this four-letter alphabet, and it's a code. If we were going to look at it this way, now this is a hypothetical kind of silly example. Here we have a string. Okay, and each one of these letters is going to represent a nucleotide. If I go back a few slides here, remember we said this is a nucleotide, this is a nucleotide, this is a nucleotide. Well, each one is represented by a letter. Now, genes could be hundreds of base pairs long. Okay, I'm pretending that this is some short little gene that's only made up of a few nucleotides. Now, let's say we were going to translate this genetic code. So we're saying that this codes for a character, some visible trait that you can see on this organism here, which is a moth. We're saying this code is telling the moth, or it codes for make a beige moth. So this gene is coding for a character or a trait that says make a beige moth. Make the protein that makes this moth beige. Okay, so simple enough. Well, you guys have probably heard this word as well, mutation. And in the context of biology, a mutation is any change in your genetic code. All right, so if we change this genetic sentence so that the third genetic word here is no longer TAC, it's TTT, again, all very hypothetical. Well, let's suppose that that changes the original code, the original instruction from make a beige moth to make a black moth. Well, now you would have a population of beige and black moths. Now, these moths that we're looking at here, these are called peppered moths. And the understanding is that during the Industrial Revolution in the UK, the pollutants in the air actually caused the barks of trees to become this black, sooty color. So, whereas before you had these beige moths here that were able to camouflage on beige tree barks, well, now the black variety of moth was able to camouflage itself on this black tree trunk. Okay, do you see what I'm getting at here? Look at this hungry guy here. I love this picture. What's he going to do? He's going to be eating moths, presumably. Let's say this is an owl that eats moths, and it will see this guy a lot easier than he would see this guy, right? So what happens? If you originally had a population of mostly beige moths, after the owl has done its work, well, the black moths are able to camouflage themselves easier than the beige moths. The owl will pick off the beige moths. And what do we have here? Well, we're going to see the population of black moths is going to increase. They'll be able to reproduce, so there'll be more black moths in future populations, right? And we would see the evolution of this particular trait. Now, what I've shown you here is natural selection. Okay, now a few things about natural selection. First of all, it's one of the main mechanisms for driving evolution. Okay, and you see here that it works on populations. It doesn't work on an individual. Individuals don't evolve. You yourself are not evolving right now, but a population of human beings, a population of moths, any population, trees, insects, they are constantly being exposed to environmental factors that are selecting for certain traits, okay, that are favored in a population, right? So here we have natural selection, and given billions of years, what we would see is maybe the evolution of a new species if these moths ever became reproductively isolated from these moths, if the black ones were ever reproductively isolated from the beige ones, meaning if they were no longer able to reproduce, we'd have a new species. And this takes many, many years. When I say many years, I'm talking billions of years. Millions, thousands, and millions and billions of years, depending on how much speciation we're talking about. I want to talk a little bit about the history of life on Earth, and just a little note about this. When we talk about natural selection and evolution, it doesn't really explain to you how life began. We will talk about some theories about that before the end of the course in another lecture, but now I just want to talk about the diversity of life on Earth. And evolution is a very powerful force in explaining how we have so many different things, living things on Earth. Well, what kinds of different living things do we have on Earth? If we look at this, I got this from Wikipedia, we believe that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Okay? And life on Earth began about 3.8 billion years old with a simple cell that we call a prokaryote. And we spoke about the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. For now, I'll just say prokaryotes are very simple cells. Okay? They have DNA, but the DNA is not contained in a nucleus. Now, by the process that we looked at before, natural selection, and some other processes that we'll talk about later on in the course, we select for differences within our population of prokaryotes. So you might say somewhere along the line there was a prokaryote that got the ability to carry out photosynthesis. In other words, the ability to get energy from the sun. All right? Now again, you probably think to yourself, well, I can kind of picture this with the moths and the little color changes, but something like photosynthesis must be pretty complicated. Well, think about this. Yes, the moth example is a little simple. We're talking about one simple color change. But that could happen comparatively quickly. Look here, 0.8 billion years between the first simple cells and what we believe were the first photosynthetic cells. What am I trying to say here? Evolution takes a very, very long time, and this is how we explain some of the very drastic changes that we might see in a population. Right? The first eukaryotic cells, complex cells, happened about 2 billion years ago. The first animals, and we're talking simple animals like a sponge. Did you know sponges were animals? Well, a very simple animal like a sponge first occurred only 600 million years ago, right? 3.8 billion years, and we have the first animal 600 million years ago. We go down to some of our favorite animals. Well, arthropods are like insects and lobsters and spiders. All right, those are all arthropods. Fish, land plants, insects, amphibians, mammals, down here, birds, 150 million years ago. And then way down here are humans, 200,000 years ago. So we're not even in the millions anymore. Okay, and you may or may not know, 200,000 years ago, there were there were many different species of humans, many of which died off. The Neanderthals are believed to have died off about 25,000 years ago, which leaves us where we are today. What you see here, look at this number. It's a pretty small number compared to this. And a little fun factoid is, if you were to divide the history of life on Earth into a 30-day calendar, well, human beings have only been around for the last hour of that 30-day month. Right? The last hour. And your life would only account for 1 second of that month. Interesting? Look at this. Here is a tree of life, a universal tree of life. If you were going to look here, okay, we would say that this point represents the common ancestor for all living organisms, the first instance of life on Earth. Now, evolution basically states that we're all related. Everything came from this cell. Think about it this way. Your family started, well, depending on who you want to consider your family actually started with this bacteria, but think about your great-great-grandparents. Right? Your great-great-grandparents, well, they would have had children And maybe you could think of these three branches here as different children, right? They had three children. Now, some of you may have brothers and sisters. You probably noticed you don't look exactly like your brothers and sisters, do you? Of course not. There's slight differences. Some of those differences are due to the way your genes are shuffled around during reproduction. Some may be due to mutations. The point is, over time, children look different from their parents and offspring. So if this cell, first of all, there would be a huge population of these prokaryotic cells, and they would give rise to cells with slight differences, right? Okay, so imagine it's siblings with slight differences, except we're not talking about individual siblings, but populations, right? But the concept is the same, that from one generation to the next we see slight differences. Three main children, let's say. One was something called a bacteria, and you're familiar with this word. One of those children, or one of these big branches, would be something called archaea. And for now, we'll just say archaea are very similar to bacteria, but they're usually found in very extreme environments. And then a third domain, a third branch called eukarya. Eukaryotic cells are more complex. They have compartments. They have a nucleus. So we have these three big branches. Now, when biologists want to classify these things and discuss things in terms of how they're related, well, we need a kind of nomenclature. We call this taxonomy. Right? And taxonomy is basically telling you, I'm going to skip ahead a few slides here, that there are three domains in life, which I showed you before: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Okay? And we could further divide those domains. As with domain eukarya is one that we're going to divide. We divide the domain eukarya into four kingdoms: plants, fungus, animals, and protists, which are kind of an odd group. So what are we doing? We're talking about how different organisms are related here. We would go back here, right? We see our three big branches: bacteria, archaea, eukarya. Okay, we look at each branch. Well, these are different types of bacteria here in this branch. I'll go to the next slide. Here's our bacteria. Here's our prokaryotes, right? These organisms don't have nuclei. Bacteria, there's different bacteria. Archaea, different archaea. Okay, eukaryotes. And what are we most interested in eukaryotes? Well, probably the stuff that we are. We're animals. The stuff that we eat, plants, other animals, of course, fungus on occasion, right? These are the living things we usually think of in our day-to-day lives. And we'll look at some of these other organisms later on. If you want to zoom in a little more onto how we're classified, well, if you go into the kingdom Animalia, we're in a phylum called Chordata, right? I won't go into the definition of what a chordate is, but among one of the things that classifies a chordate is our nervous system is dorsal. We find it on our back, right? Mammals, could you define what a mammal is? Something that's furry, something that feeds its young with milk. Well, what happens? We're going from a very inclusive group to less inclusive groups over time, right? Animals, that's very inclusive. Mammals, well, there are fewer mammals than there are animals, right? You see up here, chordates, everything with a dorsal nervous system. Mammals exclude birds and reptiles, just leaving us with that. Primates, did you know human beings are primates? You probably did. Go down here, what do we see? Genus and species. Normally when we're naming an organism, we name it according to its genus and species. Human beings are Homo sapiens, at least the human beings who are alive today. You could probably name other kinds of human beings. Homo erectus, Homo habilis. These are extinct human species. All right, so that's a little bit about taxonomy, about the different domains of life, about the different kingdoms of life. Keep this in the back of your mind as we discuss biology over the course of the semester. Cheers.